I want to welcome you all again to another night of our Adam Smith Week. This is day 3. It's a long week. But I do want to welcome you all and thank you for coming out tonight. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Professor Peter Kelcan. I'm Professor of Economics here at the College of Charleston and the Director of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process. I want to take just a minute again to thank all the people that have made this week possible, right? The Economics Department for being a sponsor, the Urban Studies Program, American Institute for Economic Research, AIER, and all that they've contributed. I want to thank our teachers from Colorado for coming out and making this trek, and all of our speakers. And I want to thank all of our students for coming out and doing so, especially our market process scholars. I know this is a long week and it's a lot. This is a busy time of the semester and they make time and make this a priority. And I appreciate all the effort and whatnot that they put into this as well. So I want to get us to continue to think about what we've been talking about over the last couple of days of urban economics and urban planning and what goes on and involved in this. And tonight's talk is I'm excited about because of the fact that it's a character in all of this that keeps coming up, right? Jane Jacobs, and Sanford Ikeda is going to talk about her tonight, and she's an iconic character, but I don't think one that enough of us know about. And so I'm excited to hear his talk. But before I get into that, let me just again remind you all a little bit about the center and everything that we do. So the Center for Public Choice and Market Process has a multitude of programs. We have our free market speaker series. We have our economic book colloquium that we run twice a year, and our regional reading group that we do with students, not only obviously here with ours, but around the region of schools from North and South Carolina. We have faculty research fellowships, and our faculty are across the campus, right? And actually external to the College of Charleston. And we have a couple of them here tonight with us. So I want to, we of course, Adam Smith Week has been our marquee event and has been sort of our hallmark of events since the very beginning. But even though it's probably not our oldest program, I think the program that has put us on the map to some degree beyond Adam Smith Week and has really brought a lot of passion and joy for me personally is our mentoring program and the Market Process Scholars Program. Getting to work with these students on a regular basis and to see all the things that they get to accomplish is really something incredible. With that, I actually want to bring up one of our market process scholars, Katie Greer, to introduce our speaker for this evening.
Hello, my name is Katie Greer, and I'm here to introduce our speaker for today. Sanford Ikeda is a professor of economics at State University of New York, where he's worked for the past 33 years. His current research focuses on the interconnection among cities, social corporations, and entrepreneurial development. He received a BA from Grover City College and a PhD from NYU in economics. Dr. Ikeda is now policy advisor to the Heartland Institute and is on the board of directors for the Economic Freedom Institute, Cosmos and Taxis, and the Center for the Living City. Dr. Ikeda is an expert on the economics of cities and takes the Austrian approach to the subject. He's the author of The Dynamics of the Mixed Economy Towards the Theory of Interventionism, as well as many, many published articles. We're very excited to have him tonight, and I'll give you the stage. Thank you.
Okay, I don't need this. I think I have. Can you hear me? Am my mic? Very good. Thank you very much. Just get set up here. Okay, here we go. Alt Tab. Okay. I'm trying to get to the full screen view. Okay.
It's like a little dialogue box. It's stuck out.
Okay. So Thank you. Well, while that's happening, I want to thank Peter and the center for inviting me out here to speak on my very favorite subject to all of you. And over the last few days, I got here on Monday, I got to know many of you. And I think this is College of Charleston is a wonderful place. It's beautiful, but the people here are equally beautiful, if I can say that. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to talking to you tonight and then afterwards as well. Okay, so first of all, let me ask you, how many of you have heard, well, apart from the previous mentions in the lectures, how many of you have had heard of Jane Jacobs before? Okay. Oh, all right. So some of you, but I'm going to go under the assumption that you haven't really heard of her or know very much about her. She's she died in 2006. She's perhaps the greatest urbanist ever. Urbanist can be defined as someone who's interested in cities and loves cities and studies some aspect of cities. And I think in any group of people who are interested in urbanism, they will have heard of her because she's a giant. She's a giant who never graduated from college, who never had an academic position. I'll say a little bit more about her background in a moment, but she's someone that I read about 25 years ago after having bought her book, Death and Life of Great American Cities, that I, as a graduate student, put on my bookshelf and then never took down. Well, it took me about a decade to take down and read it. And when I did, it was like, boom, really resonated with me. So the reason it resonated with me, because I'm trained in Orthodox economics, but also I'm inspired by the work of Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek and Israel Kirzner, who was one of my professors at New York University, where I studied. And so there are two things that captivated me about The Death and Life of Great American Cities, published in 1961. First of all, it did resonate with me in the sense that what she was talking about was my economics, how I understood economics and how I understood social theory. But the second thing that resonated with me was her introducing me to the importance of cities and of city planning, which I'd never thought of before. I mean, when I was your age and somebody mentioned urban economics, my eyes would drift away. It was not something I was particularly interested in. But once I started reading Jacobs and learning about cities, I realized, in a sense, cities are everything. In a sense that I hope to convey tonight. Anyway, so I had a chance to meet Jane Jacobs in 2004, only a couple of years before she passed away. It was a meeting arranged by Pierre Desrochers and three other scholars, and we went to her house in Toronto and spent over 3 hours talking with her. She had just finished her manuscript for the last book that she published, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So she had time, and we were able to talk with her and ask her all these questions we'd come up with while we were waiting. So it was one of the greatest thrills I've had in my life. It's right up there with riding in a taxi with Friedrich Hayek for 15 minutes. Maybe better, because this was 3.5 hours. We really got into some interesting discussions. Okay, so one of the things that got me interested in digging deeper into her work was the fact that a lot of the economics that I had learned from Hayek and Mises and Kirzner, she filled in a lot of the institutional gaps of how entrepreneurship happens, how competition happens. By institutional gap, I mean what cities are and the nature and significance of them. So I'll say something about that as well. But before I go any further, I have to say the title of my talk tonight, Learning Economics and Social Theory from Jane Jacobs, is actually the subtitle of a book that I've just finishing. The full title is A City Cannot Be a Work of Art, okay, Learning Economics and Social Theory from Jane Jacobs. So maybe I can sell some books to, actually, I won't sell any books because it's going to be open access. And so you could download it for free later on this year, fingers crossed. Right, so what I want to do, this is what she looks like if you haven't seen her before. This is a really nice picture of her. Jane Jacobs has had many books written about her. She's had a play and an opera written about her. There's a play, or was a play, just off Broadway in New York called Straight Line Crazy, about Robert Moses, in which she plays a important role, important character. The actor who plays Robert Moses is, who's the actor who plays Voldemort? Yeah, that guy. So he was the big draw, but so I went to go see this play. It was fantastic. So the last book she wrote that I mentioned a moment ago is Dark Age Ahead. And it's sort of a pessimistic view of what might happen. It's not a prediction of what will happen, but there's certain trends that she was identifying. I won't spend too much time on that, although there are some quotes later that I'm going to draw from that. So I'm going backwards, actually. So she published Dark Age Ahead just before she died in 2006. In the year 2000, she wrote The Nature of Economies, which was a distillation of a lot of her thoughts about economic theory and economic development. Systems of Survival was her foray into ethics. And I'll touch on that later as well. But basically, she saw a distinction between taking and making as a principal division between the ethics of basically government, which is based on taking, and the ethics of commerce and markets, which is making. Now, she wasn't saying one was better than the other, but she just said we have to judge behavior in each of these spheres based on the nature of how they acquire wealth. Cities and Wealth Nations, she published in 1984, which talked about how cities interrelate with each other globally. One city relates to, let's say, New York relates to Paris, relates to Tokyo, but also the smaller cities and the roles that they play in the economy and economic development. In 1969, she published The Economy of Cities, which is about how cities generate innovation, how imports and exports, the role of imports and exports in a city produce the conditions for entrepreneurial discovery and innovation. And so this is Death and Life of Great American Cities, which she published in 1961. It's the one that anyone who knows Jacobs knows this book and hopefully has read it. Now, I'm writing this book, A City Cannot Be a Work of Art, in part because, yes, what we get from Jacobs in this book is often a critique of heavy-handed urban planning, a la 1950s United States. Although even though it has American cities in the title, it actually applies to cities not only across the world today, but also going back in time and probably forward in the future too. But what wasn't appreciated was the framework, the analytical framework from which her criticisms of urban planning emerged. Where does it come from? And so people who are devotees of Jacobs, and I know many of them. I know people who were associates of hers. I'm on the board of the Center for the Living City, which is founded by her friends, personal friends and colleagues. But even amongst them, I don't feel that they appreciate fully the underlying economics and social theory. What often happens is, they own different parts of this book, kind of like the Bible, they inspire different things and different people. Some they inspire activism and community activism, or others they'll get nice design ideas. We should have porches on our houses. We should design for walkability, which is all very good. but there's so much under there. There's so much low-hanging fruit in terms of social theory and economics that I'm trying to draw out in this book, and I'll give you a taste of in my talk tonight. So this is a list of her major books in white lettering, which I've just gone through. The ones in dark lettering are lesser well-known. Constitutional Chaff has to do with, she wrote when she was 22 years old, and she'd taken a course at Columbia University. She wasn't a matriculated student, but she just took courses which she wanted to take at Columbia. And one of them had to do with constitutional history. And she was intrigued by the fact that not everything that was proposed by the founding fathers actually went into the Constitution. So she took a lot of the leftovers of the chaff and put them into this book and did some analysis. I confess I have not read this book yet. A Question of Separatism is about Quebec separatism in the context of other separatist movements. And then A Teacher in Old Alaska is about her aunt, probably a great lady who taught in Alaska, much like herself. But I'm focusing on the ones, the five that I've listed. Is that 5? 6 that I listed in white letters. So I'll say something about her economics first. And what I've done, I try to avoid putting a lot of verbiage up on screens, and I always fail, right? Because your attention's up there, and it should be. So what I like to do, I mean, I could have told you about her economics and social theory, but I thought it might be good if you were actually to see samples of it. Okay. And so we can read this together and I'll say something about it and give you more of a context. So here she's talking about the city-state versus a city versus the nation. She says, what a national economy is really just the economy of cities. It's composed of economies of cities. What's important about this that I want to draw your attention to is that for her, cities are a basic unit of economic analysis. And the nation state is not. It's not that the nation state isn't real, but it's artificial in the sense that cities want to grow beyond national boundaries if import and export restrictions didn't get in the way at the national level. Okay, so that's an important lesson. One of the important lessons that I learned in reading. So I just sort of took it for granted that nation states were a natural unit of economic analysis, but they aren't really. What drives nations are the things that go on in cities. Okay, so her economics is not orthodox economics. Doesn't have to do with efficiency, for example, which I'll talk about in a moment, or static competition, perfect competition, and things like that. Her interest in economics had to do with creativity, experimentation, trial and error as a precursor to innovation, right? So here she says, development work, economic development, is a messy, time-consuming, energy-consuming business of trial and error and failure. The only certainties in it are trial and error. Success is not a certainty, and even when the result is successful, it is often a surprise and not what was actually sought. For example, when you graduate from here and you go maybe find a job someplace in another city, as Alain Bertrand says, you're going to city because of the other people there and the opportunities that they offer. But you'll probably change jobs many times once you get there. Why? Why don't you go from one job to another to get to a really good job? Well, why don't you go to the really good job first, right? Why waste your time? Well, it's because you don't know. And that job probably isn't there when you first go. So when you go to a different place, when you go to a city, the environment offers these unforeseen opportunities, but it also changes you. It changes your expectations and your knowledge. So you probably will end up doing something different, maybe very different from what you expected. You may be majoring in economics, but you may be an artist, you may be a writer, you may be doing something you don't even consider. Like when I was as I said, a student, urban economics was like not even on my agenda. Okay, so this is a long quote. So let me just read what's highlighted here. She says, I propose to argue that these grave and real deficiencies, the error, the failure, et cetera, these are necessary to economic development and thus are exactly what makes cities uniquely valuable to economic life. In other words, these are venues, these are incubators of ideas and experimentation, but only after you've done all this messy trial and error. So she says, by this, I do not mean that cities are economically valuable in spite of their inefficiency, in spite of the trial and error. Okay, it's not in spite of their inefficiency and impracticality, but rather because they are inefficient and impractical. You know, and you learn economics, right? Efficiency is when you do something at lowest cost. That's what efficiency is. But that assumes that you know what your end is, what the goal is, what the objective function is, and you know what all the arguments are. You know what the means are. So you select among the various means to achieve a given objective S, X, A, B, C means, and X is your goal. And you say, okay, well, B is the least cost way of getting to X. So I choose B. That's the most efficient. And that works in the model, right? And not to disparage the model or that kind of modeling. But that's not what Jacobs is interested in. She says, well, how can you facilitate the learning of what the means are and what your ends are? So that's not conventional economics, right? But economic development and the economic innovation are a little bit closer to that. Okay, but it's still not quite there in terms of what Jacobs was satisfied with. So microeconomics, with its emphasis on equilibrium and efficiency, is not her economics. Neither is conventional macroeconomics. So in 1984, this comes from Cities and Wealth of Nations, which she published in 1984. It says these disparaging things about macroeconomics. It's a shambles. And then down here, never has a science or supposed science been so generously indulged, right, by governments and different kinds of modeling and experiments that are conducted at, monetary policy and fiscal policy. And never have experiments left in their wakes more wreckage, unpleasant surprises, blasted hopes and confusion, to the point that the question seriously arises whether the wreckage is reparable. If it is, certainly not with more of the same. Okay, so this is, she didn't think very much of conventional macroeconomics. Now, this was macroeconomics circa 1980. And those of us who studied macro, especially, I started graduate school in 1980. That was a terrible time to be learning macroeconomics, because it was transitioning from sort of conventional ISLM, Hicksian type analysis to a more micro-based analysis. You have micro foundations of macroeconomics, and that was just happening. So today, what you learn when you study macroeconomics in graduate school, you're basically learning microeconomic theoretical foundations to macro, and microeconomics has also changed a lot since the 1980s. Okay, but anyway, the kind of macroeconomics that still informs Congress and monetary policy by the Fed, and when the president makes a statement, is really the old-fashioned macroeconomics, basically, because the new stuff is just too complicated. Okay, the other part of the thing that resonated with me with Jacobs is her recognition that there's a knowledge problem, that urban planners face a knowledge. This is what she says in 1961, Death and Life. Right? Urban planners face a knowledge problem because the kind of knowledge they need is located street level, observing what people are actually doing. Okay, so no other expertise can substitute for locality knowledge. She uses the term locality knowledge. Hayek talks about local knowledge, right? Very similar. No other expertise can substitute for locality knowledge and planning, whether the planning is creative, coordinating, or predictive. So you have to go and you have to see, you have to monitor what real estate prices are, what mobility is. You have to actually, and in her case, actually see how people are using spaces. And what planning has to do is to accommodate what people are doing. Planning should complement, not substitute for, the actions of individuals. Something about economic development, I mentioned a moment ago. Okay, so how does innovation happen? Well, it's urban-based. Why urban-based? Why not suburban? Well, cities that are successful, usually we think of big cities, but they can be medium-sized or smaller cities, but are those that innovate and that create artistically and commerce and so forth. How do they do that? Well, they attract people like you with fresh ideas that are, different from the conventional or the orthodoxy, people from different backgrounds, different cultures, races, attitudes, religions, and so forth. They're attracted to cities because there's opportunity there, right? You want to get a job, right? That's important. But also because the sort of the psychosociological part of it is cities are places where you can remake yourself, right? I come from I left Mesa, Arizona when I had a population of about 150,000, relatively small city. It's now much bigger. But, I would still run into people who either knew me or knew my father or knew my brother. Said, oh, it helped that I was Asian because I was I think 2% of the population was Asian. So I was also often misidentified. Anyway, it was that kind of thing. Oh, I know your father, we went to high school together and things like that. It was really nice. There's certain benefits to those kind of thick ties. But I'm kind of glad I left. I went to New York and discovered things there and about myself that I may not have been able to discover, back in my small hometown. So there's an anonymity and privacy in cities that people find, a way to expand this. So also, it could be depressing. I mean, there's a downside to it as well. Okay, you can be sad in cities in ways you never dreamed in a small town. So that's, I don't want to ignore that. But I mean, my point is, though, that cities attract all this diversity, which brings in new information, basically, new knowledge, skills, and tastes. Okay, think of restaurants, the kinds of restaurants you can sample. Charleston, but if you go to Atlanta, or if you go to New York, or you go to Tokyo, and it's just all this cuisine as an example, your tastes expand. You will eat stuff that you never dreamed you'd eat before. You like some of that stuff. And so from the demand side and supply side, people who make this diverse stuff can find a market for it, okay? Which is harder to do in a smaller city or smaller settlement. Okay, let me say something about social theory. Underlying this economics, there's overlap here, which I will point out. So what do I mean by social theory? It's theory of society, how the social order functions, okay, of which economics is an important part, but it's not the only part. But what is underlying this? Well, again, we talk about knowledge, imperfect knowledge. So this quote comes from an interview with a journalist named David Warren in Canada. And she just says, you can't know ahead of time what you're going to discover, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't discover it. How can you find out except by fiddling around? So again and again, she emphasizes imperfect knowledge, right? Life is full of imperfect knowledge, whether you're in a city or not. But cities are places where imperfect knowledge, the problems that derive from imperfect knowledge are solved. The architect Rem Koolhaas I'm paraphrasing him. He said something like, talking about New York or Manhattan, that it's a place where forces of order are able to stay ahead of the forces of chaos, sometimes just barely. So cities create problems. When we go to cities, we're adding new problems to cities, but cities have the capability, when they're functioning well, of addressing those problems, and they'll grow wealthier, and there'll be new kinds of arts and commerce and things like that. When they're not, they'll decline. People will leave. There's too much crime. There's too much pollution, whatever. So cities create problems at the same time they're able to solve them. So this is part of the imperfect knowledge idea of that is the reason why we have to experiment and conduct trial and error. And again, cities are the institutional matrix in which this ideally takes place. If you go outside cities, if there were no cities, then, and we know there are historical periods, the Middle Ages, for example, when cities, at least in the West, disappeared. And you have stasis, more or less. I mean, it's not that simple, but things basically stopped progressing in the ways that they had in ancient Greece and even under the Romans. Okay, long quote again, complexity. So she, in her last chapter of her 1961 book, she titled that book, "The Kind of Problem a City Is." And she had read the scientist administrator Warren Weaver, who characterized three different problems. First of all, there was in the Enlightenment with Newton and so forth. Warren Weaver said there are problems of simplicity. Basically, you have functional relationships, y equal f of x, or y equal f of x and z, and so forth. Limited number of variables which are comprehensible and solvable. Then Weaver said, beginning in the 20th century, probability theory, statistics, observing gases and their behaviors, and Brownian motion, and this kind of thing, were so tools were developed. Statistical mechanics was developed to address that kind of phenomenon. But she said, well, biology and the life sciences were kind of, these tools were somewhat useful, but not so much. And cities are very much like the life sciences in the sense that there are a limited number of variables or factors that interact with each other in complex ways that generate outcomes which are not subject to point predictions, right? With problems of with statistics, where you have the mean, variance, and so forth, and with a simple algebraic equation, you can come up with some solution to it. But in cities aren't like that. You can, now Hayek would say, you can generate pattern predictions. So what Jacob said in 1961 is, if you have, and Emily Hamilton mentioned this last night, 4 factors she identified as generating sufficient diversity that allows cities to be successful. Okay, one is short blocks, another is multiple primary uses, attractors into a neighborhood. Another is sufficiently cheap and old buildings so that people with not much capital, with new ideas, can experiment and do all this sort of thing. And short blocks, in other words, this some sort of granularity and granularity and diversity in land uses. And what this produces is a larger diversity. You can get to use the example of after World War II, when Japan was importing bicycles. Japan was relatively poor, so they couldn't afford automobiles, so they imported bicycles. And I meant from the United States. And after a while, when these bicycles had to be repaired, there were shops that produce tires, shops that produce frames and pedals, and gears, and things like that. Somebody had the idea that, well, all these diverse elements, we just build our own bicycles. We have know-how and we can do it. And so Shimano, Centurion, these sort of bicycles that, well, at least when I grew up, these were big names in bicycling, and they've shipped internationally, including back to the United States. Right, the United States had Schwinn and so forth, which had to keep up. Later on, of course, Japan, through this sort of innovation and discovery, grew rich enough to import automobiles. And we know what happened there, right? Same kind of process occurred. All right, so cities are complex in this way. You can't predict exactly what these four factors are going to do, right? Granularity, short blocks, and so forth. But what she says, well, what will happen is that you're going to generate land use diversity sufficient if you allow people to exercise their resourcefulness to generate new products, new arts, be creative, to experiment, in other words. Also to fail. Right? Failure is really important. But the society has to be one that not only makes heroes out of successful people, but also tolerates people who fail. Right? You may not like it, but there are societies where they don't like change because it often leads to failure. But again, going back to Rem Koolhaas, if you have a successful environment, social environment, the forces of order will stay ahead of the forces of chaos. Okay, another part of her social theory, which I've mentioned a couple of times, is diversity. Now, in Death and Life of Great American Cities, she primarily means land use diversity. Okay, as in the example I gave you with the bicycles in Japan. What happens is that not only does it, that example had more to do with production. In Death and Life, what she is getting at is how big cities solve the problem of safety. Because you have hundreds of thousands, millions of people coming together, obviously don't know each other, who are socially distant, right? They're weird, right? A lot of them, and frightening sometimes. Different languages, different mannerisms, different customs. Okay, but you have to be able to, tolerate it somehow. And she says, well, if you can make public spaces safe, streets, sidewalks, plazas, public spaces are where you expect to encounter strangers. If you can make those safe, and people feel safe, then people won't come out and use them. How do you do that? Well, you attract people at different times of the day, right? You don't have a single massive use in a neighborhood or district like a I don't know, baseball stadium, right? That's maybe full 3 times a week, but then it's empty the rest of the time, deserted, which is dangerous and it repels. So if you have a baseball stadium, that's fine, but you need to have some residential residences, maybe some commercial spaces, office spaces within that particular area, so that different people are attracted to the streets at different times of the day on different days. So when you see a lot of people out there, you just, okay, I'll walk out there. Right? If there's nobody out there, you think twice. You may still do it, but people attract people. The lack of people tends to repel. So the bedrock attribute of any great city, she said, is the feeling that people have of safety and security. And so one way to do that is to have land use diversity, different uses in the same relatively small area. And what that does is people feel safe. They will feel safer to make certain contacts, whether it's business, could be social, could be based on entertainment or religion or whatever. They'll feel safer to make those kinds of contacts in public. And it's that contact which is the are the conduits. Those relationships are the conduits through which information is acquired and spread. In this quote, she says, if self-government in the place is to work, that is, people solving their own problems in a local community, underlying any float of population must be a continuity of people who have forged neighborhood networks. These networks are a city's irreplaceable social capital. Whenever the capital is lost from whatever cause, the income from it disappears, never to return until and unless new capital is slowly and chancely accumulated. This is an important quote. 1961, it's the first use of the term social capital, not ever, but it's the first use of the term social capital in the contemporary meaning, which is relationships with others that increase our value productivity. Right? Some people define it as social networks that allow us to fully utilize our human capital. So Jacobs, I claim she coined this term in this particular way. And this is what happens when you have a safe environment, when you have diversity that brings people out and they have contact and they can form these relationships. I mean, think of the relationships you have sitting here, you know, your fellow students, but you may work, you may have a church, you may have your family and friends, right? There are myriad networks that you're a part of. Okay? And you think about, well, where do those networks live? And generally speaking, they're in public spaces. If you feel frightened, then you're not going to occupy those spaces. All right, and this has to do with tolerance. Tolerance is possible and normal only when streets in great cities have built-in equipment, allowing strangers to dwell in peace together and on civilized but essentially dignified and reserved terms. And so how does that happen? When people are out there already. How are they out there? When they're attracted to those public spaces. Well, what people? Well, you have to have a pretty high density of people, high concentration of people, because they're not all going to go to school. They're not all going to work, you know, in the neighborhood. They're not all going to live there even, but you have enough people to draw on to fill the public spaces in that neighborhood at different times of the day, and allow you to feel safe and to therefore tolerate differences. You feel safe enough to tolerate it. And then, of course, the other part of this is you have to have norms of tolerance and so forth. If you have norms of exclusivity that only people who are wearing the clothing I am or speak like me, well, that will defeat this. Okay. However, cities are places where people who, like the Orthodox Jewish community in Brooklyn, okay, which is an insular society if there ever was one. Okay. However, the people who live there, the men mostly, they have jobs in Midtown Manhattan, and they'll go to work, and that's maybe where they live, but they have contacts with the bigger world, which probably wouldn't happen if they're just living in the isolated shtetl someplace, right? They have a shtetl within Brooklyn, but it's immersed in all this diversity. Okay, so you have to have trust. She talks about trust, right? That the person that you're going to have walking towards you on the sidewalk is not going to make you feel uncomfortable or harm you in any way. I mean, that's just the very basic thing. But it goes farther than that, right? If you're going to have a business relationship with someone in a city, you have to feel confident enough that they're not going to take advantage of you when you're vulnerable. You make them a loan, they promise to pay you back. What does that have to do with cities? Well, cities are where these things tend to have emerged, right? Cities are like New York or Amsterdam are financial centers because they're commercial centers. And so you have to make these relationships based on trust over time. Okay, tolerance I mentioned, I'm just going to skip that. Oh, going the wrong way. All right, so I'm just going to say a few things about policy. Got about 5 minutes or so. So this is what most people, when they think of Jacobs, associate her with. Criticism of Robert Moses's planning. Moses was famous for building highways. He did other things too, built parks and public housing, but we associate with him with building highways through neighborhoods. But really what she was talking about was the wrong kind of central planning. So this is from Dark Age Ahead, the last book that she published in 2006. She says, central planning, whether by leftists or conservatives, right, whether you're a socialist or a fascist, draws too little on local knowledge. Now she's using that term as Hayek does. By the way, I don't have any solid evidence that she read Hayek, although some of us who have talked to her have mentioned him to her, but she never cites him. Hayek cites Jacobs once that I know of. It's in Constitutional Liberty on the in the chapter called Town Planning. Okay. But she gets just a small footnote. So it's interesting. These two intellectual giants who are writing very similar things have really the same social theory, which is the argument in my book, who don't really cite each other, don't really know each other. Anyway, so central planning, whether by leftists or conservatives, draw too little on local knowledge and creativity, stifles innovations, and is inefficient and costly because it is circuitous. It bypasses intimate and varied knowledge directly fed back into the system, which he's talking about as markets. Right, so socialists and fascists or leftists and rightists want to protect different parts of the economy, right? Not allow markets to function. When that happens, you're not going to get the proper feedback mechanism that markets offer. So in general, this is actually from 1961. Talks about public policy. This is the context here is planning. Urban planning. So public policy can do relatively little that is positive to get working uses woven in where they are absent and needed in cities. In other words, public policy cannot deliberately create diversity of land use, okay, other than permit and indirectly encourage them, can enable diversity of land use. But, you know, enabling may be too strong a word too, because it generally just happens. Right? If you leave people alone and say, okay, this is your property, you can do whatever you want. And so people will adjust. Throughout history where there's been no urban planning, and urban planning is you know, relatively new, last 120 years or so, this happens spontaneously. Okay. Oh, I should mention, honestly, the invisible hand is at work. I mean, this is all Smithian. Okay. I thought I'd mention it. So, but then she goes on to say, given enough federal funds and enough power, planners can easily destroy city primary mixtures, like diversity, faster than these can grow in unplanned districts, so that there is a net loss of basic primary mixture. So by putting a highway through a neighborhood that was functioning very well, you destroy that fiber, you destroy the fine structure of society that made that neighborhood and that city successful. I mean, it doesn't even have to be that. She describes how the first 3 chapters of Death and Life of Great American Cities are about sidewalks. And one example she gives is, well, you know, in a city like New York or any established city, if you want to widen the streets to accommodate cars, then you're going to have to narrow the sidewalks and other public spaces where people can engage each other face to face. And so it's going to limit contact. And it's going to make it feel inconvenient to go out into public space, which will repel people. And if they're not there, the lack of people will repel still other people. And so pretty soon it gets pretty dangerous to go out there, or not very interesting to go out into public space. So there are these unintended consequences from changing one of the variables, or we're talking about organized complexity, change one variable, and it's going to have major consequences if we're not very careful. Okay, I'll end with a couple of quotes, which don't have directly to do with any sort of urban policy, but I think they're informative. I told you, well, actually, this is a bit of, she says, to seek causes of poverty in this way is to enter an intellectual dead end, because poverty has no causes. Only prosperity has causes. Poverty is the lack of prosperity. It's just like darkness is the absence of light. So for her, I think that's me, telling me to stop. And I will in a moment. So that's why she emphasizes economic development and innovation. The city thrives when there's creativity, when the circumstances exist where people can be creative in different ways. If they're not creative, if they're still sort of doing the same thing over and over again, they may do the same thing over and over again more and more efficiently. But she says this is stasis. And you're no longer what you would call a great city, a living city. So only prosperity has causes. And then the basis of her ethical writing, or systems of survival, based on this foundation for her ethics, which she calls the commercial syndrome or commercial ethics, is based on trade, production and trade, and then what she calls the guardian ethics, the ethics that govern most governmental functions, is based on taking. So we have two distinct syndromes because we have two distinct ways of making a living, no more and no less. First, we're able to take what we want, but in addition, we human beings are capable of trading. And she says, of course, everybody doesn't have to make a living. Some people will get by on gifts, charity, or inheritances, but that means somebody else worked up the wherewithal. How do they manage that? We're back to two ways of doing so: taking, transferring wealth, or producing and trading. All right, so I'm going to end here. And these are areas of public policy that she's best known for. Okay, but again, I don't want to obscure the point that I'm trying to make, is that she had a lot to say about economics, economic theory, particularly about development. And she had a very coherent social theory that underpins both her economics and her comments and criticisms of urban planning. Oh, so this is the last. I think this captures a lot. This is from her 1961 book. So she says, there's a quality even meaner than outright ugliness or disorder, and this meaner quality is the dishonest mask of pretended order, achieved by ignoring or suppressing the real order that is struggling to exist and to be served. So the real order is the invisible hand. It's the spontaneous, emergent order. The pretended order is the imposition of an ideal image of what a city or an economy or a lifestyle should be. Again, she's not a anarcho-capitalist or radical libertarian, because she believed that government had a very important role. You know, government planning, government intervention, whatever you want to call it, government policy, as long as it complements the spontaneous order, is to be desired. Once it steps beyond that, we need to be suspicious. I didn't want to end on the word suspicious, but we should be we should be careful.
So we have two microphones set up here for questions, so that the people who are on Zoom can hear the questions and so forth. This always would defer to our process scholars to potentially ask about the first question today. Have any?
Thank
I
you
mean,
so
I could hear you from right there.
I know, got everyone here. So thank you so much. And you kind of mentioned this at the very last slide when we talk about the role of limited government and like that central planning relies too little on local knowledge. So it should only be used to like permit and encourage like diversity of land use. Can you go a little bit more into the way in which there can be maybe not effective, but like necessary government intervention or like government regulation and land use?
Yeah, I mean, in the urban planning context, Jacobs believes the government should provide public services, specifically streets, water, sewage, electricity. There's certain things that the municipal government should do. But she also has a chapter about the decentralization of political authority down to the lowest level of effective operation. It could be the neighborhood or it could be the district, which would take care of things like street cleaning, police, housing, things like that. Pollution would be more citywide. Okay, you couldn't handle that exclusively locally. Streets and highway systems would have to be done at the municipal level, if not beyond that. But most of the things that people encounter, the externalities, positive and negative. Well, let's think about the negative externalities of crime, of pollution, of noise. She said, well, trying to, in a big city, this might work in a small town. You have a central authority that handles everything. In a big city like New York or London or Paris, complaining to City Hall or wherever the municipal government is, that knowledge is lost. So that local knowledge, the problems and possible solutions that the local people have should be utilized locally. So governments should try to do more of that and not try to substitute for what could be solved at the local level.
Thank you.
I happen to question that myself. I mean, there's certain things that Jacobs advocates that I'm not in favor of, but that's to be expected. I'm a classical liberal, and I think she is, but she's not a radical libertarian like me.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I've always been a fan of Jane Jacobs, but didn't have any idea how ignorant I was about the depth of her
You're not alone.
her reports. You had a number of different points that I would like to discuss further, but one that really I just popped into my mind as you were discussing the cities and how they rise and how they fall. And once they fail, it becomes very difficult for them to recover. And I just wonder about the cities that we have today, like New York, San Francisco, they seem to be inevitably, and London and Paris, but they're going
I mean, these are the cities you name are certainly have their troubles, and I would agree with you that it's very serious and perhaps more serious than they have been in the past. But failed cities, I mean, you might think of Detroit, you might think of St. Louis. That is to say, which have both lost population. That's a very good indicator of city failure. If people are moving out of New York, has a population of it's New York City, just the municipality has never been bigger. It's the biggest it's ever been in history. It's like over 8.5, 8.6 million. Now, I think last I said, 8.8 before the pandemic. And it's never been that big before. So yeah, I wouldn't call those, but your point is that the certain cities fail. So how do they come back? Well, Detroit is an interesting case, right? Because for a number of reasons it fails, right? Political, and some of this had to do with the being overly dependent on just on automobile manufacturing and related related industries, unions and pensions and so forth, which affected that as well. So, for many years, people were leaving, but it's starting gradually to come back. Okay, now, about 10 years ago, the government tried to have a big idea to let's sink capital into a people movement, a tram system. The question is, well, where are they going to go? Why would anybody use this? But what happened, so aside from that didn't work. What happened was a lot of local people, and this isn't the only thing, but this is what I know about. Local people who grew up usually in poor neighborhoods that had been decimated by the conditions, people leaving in a depressed city, who knew property because they were locals, had local knowledge, would do things like buy up certain houses which they thought would have the best chance of making a profit. It'd be something like buy 4 houses and then fix one up right away and rent it, and use the income from that to fix the other ones up, right? To sell at a higher price or to rent at a higher price, and they'd have some left over and they'd buy more property this way. I mean, that's just one thing that happened. From my own college, Purchase College, we had art professors who would go there with students for art projects. And they would go into neighborhoods that were suffering and construct, art displays and mosaics and things like that to just to, make life a little bit nicer. It's just, tiny, in other words, just sort of marginal changes. That's what Jacob says, that it takes a long time and it's slowly coming back. You can't come back from that kind of devastation all at once. But it seems to me that Detroit is coming back. St. Louis, I don't know. Don't know enough to say. St. Louis lost half the population.
There's one. So which force has the greatest potential to disform cities and change their social character? Wall Street investment capital or the national infrastructure monies?
So could you just read that again?
Yeah. So which force has the greater potential to disform cities and change their social character? Wall Street investment capital or the national infrastructure monies? Which force would Jacobs identify?
Well, insofar as what the person is asking this is referring to private capital investment and not sort of public-private partnerships, which involve eminent domain and issuing municipal bonds and raising money that way through the capital, which is not exactly free market, right? Insofar as it's private, certainly the amount of money going into a city or district is much less than the federal government can muster with its taxing power and so forth. Jacobs calls both withdrawing a lot of money suddenly, but also investing tremendous amounts of money into a neighborhood or district. She calls that cataclysmic money. She says, for example, if you were to build a housing project or a civic center or a sports complex, there are all kinds of problems that can generate, right? Because it's a problem of complexity. She says that, for one thing, if you're building, in my borough of Brooklyn, they built a basketball stadium for the Brooklyn Nets. And originally what they wanted to do was to build the stadium plus office spaces plus residences. It didn't happen because of legal challenges, but it just kept growing and growing because the developers were able to utilize public funds. So they had a soft budget constraint, which kept expanding and expanding. So if they had been successful, what you have is very expensive real estate that's developed. The only people who are going to afford to live there or afford to move their offices there are already established firms or already people who are rich. And it's going to age at the same rate. So when things start to break down, it's going to be very expensive to repair everything. So this kind of massive build, it's like having a monoculture forest growing all aspen trees, for example, which makes those trees vulnerable to the same kind of disease. And you have the same sort of thing happening. Yeah, I use this example. When I was in Tucson, they put me up in a very nice area that was just developed, beginning about 4 or 5 years ago. Condominium complex, restaurants at one end with high-end clothing stores, nice coffee house that sells a cup of coffee for $4.50. On the other end was something called the Annex, which had these container stores and selling clothing and things like that. Everything was really nice, but it's expensive. Why? Because the only businesses that could afford to move there were businesses that were already successful elsewhere or that had a lot of money. So this is where my potato chip theory comes in. I have one of the criteria I have for urbanism is, can you go out at night and buy a bag of potato chips? Okay, one night I really wanted a bag of potato chips. And I realized if I want a bag of potatoes, I have to get into my car, drive out to the Safeway, like 5 miles away, buy a bag of potato chips, and I'm not going to do it. I couldn't go to any of these stores because they're not selling potato chips. If I wanted toilet paper, I couldn't do that. And so I know that Charleston is very urban because the other night I went out for potato chips on King Street and I found a bag of potato chips. And they also had, I think, Kleenex and toilet paper there, so it was great.
Sandy, back to the original question that this young woman asked about, and you talked about one of the political principles she advocated was subsidiarity. You know, that government works best, most responsibly and responsively when it's closest to the people it serves and needs it addresses. I haven't read her book about Quebec and the secession and separatism, but did she write about the scale of cities and population and things like that? Is there a certain,
No hard and fast number, but the title of her book is Death and Life of Great American Cities. So she had in mind cities that had a population of 2, 3 million, 4 million. I mean, New York, for example. So that's actually an interesting research area that I may go into next, is to what extent do those principles apply to smaller cities? And I think they do. I mean, Charlotte is a good example.
Mm-hmm.
Charlotte, I keep saying, excuse me, Charleston. Charleston.
Well, I'm thinking of, Aristotle wrote about there's a certain size of cities that works best. And I know, like in New York, you mentioned that it's grown, but Manhattan actually, it's nowhere close to, the population today is nowhere close to what it was in 1910. And it's probably roughly, I know it's come back, but to be roughly the size of the population it was when she lived there. But I wonder about the effect of governance, back to her principle of subsidiarity and her advocacy for that.
I don't know if this directly addresses what you're saying, but I say I live in New York City. More specifically, I live in Brooklyn. More specifically, I live in Brooklyn Heights. That's my neighborhood. And almost everybody who lives in New York City lives in a neighborhood. It could be Greenwich Village, it could be Upper East Side, Harlem, Forest Hills. I mean, these are different neighborhoods. And most of these neighborhoods are places where people spend much of their time, and they live there, but they may not, and probably don't work there, but they do almost everything else there. Like in Brooklyn Heights, we walk to 2 supermarkets to do shopping. We do our vet is within the neighborhood. If we wanted to, we could go to a doctor, but we usually go into Manhattan for a doctor. So my point is that what Aristotle was talking about in terms of the polis and the optimal size is somewhere between 5,000 and 30,000, right? Well, that's about the size of Brooklyn Heights. Brooklyn Heights has a population of about 25,000. And so these different neighborhoods are like that. I mean, now the difference between an isolated polis of 25,000 or a small town of 25,000 is during the day, you don't have floods of strangers coming in and so forth. And that's the difference. But it nevertheless, right, the structures that enable people to feel safe and to trust one another, the stability is very similar in those two places. In fact, Brooklyn Heights couldn't survive unless it had this underlying basis of public trust that's formed by people who've lived there for a while and have the same kinds of norms.
Yeah, I wonder, you think about, all right, Brooklyn Heights, you mentioned it had a population of 30,000.
Yeah, 25,000.
Yeah. So the United States emerged from a place of small cities. And in her book, Constitutional Chaff, at the time, in 1790, the first census, the population of New York was 30,000. Philadelphia was 27,000.
Yeah.
Boston was like 16 and Charleston was 15.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there's something about the size of cities and the limit to that stimulates creativity, intellectual growth. I mean, you think about Florence during the Renaissance or some of these other places that were so relatively small.
Right. Florence had a population of about 15,000. But it's relative to the time and the
Sure.
social context. But like I say, so in London, there are neighborhoods in Paris and certainly in Tokyo, they're giant cities, but you live in a particular district or neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And that's your home base. So it's not the same thing as being in a isolated polis. By the way, right, Athens was quite large, right? It had a population of 150,000.
Mm-hmm. I think so. Yeah.
And for its time, it was very big.
Well,
So what the heck was he talking about?
Yeah.
What?
Rome also at its site.
Rome had a population, in its height, had a population of 1 million
Mm-hmm.
with no indoor plumbing. Can you imagine?
Thanks.
Thank you.
So I'll do as I often do and take the prerogative to ask the last question. And you hit on this a little bit with sort of the online question, but I'm curious, one of the things you didn't mention, but I think I know what her answer would be, but I'm curious what you think in the way that we think about economic development today, the way that states and cities often do economic development, where we go out and we identify, and again, an existing firm, and we give them tax breaks and subsidies and so forth, and we pick sort of the winners and losers and say, come here and you will, generate this major impact on a city. And sort of maybe what your take on how Jacob would have viewed, or if she ever commented on those types of development activities.
Not that I know of. Well, I mean, let me take it back. She said that countries that try to advance, say, technologically very quickly, we could, name some, that import scientists, technologies and engineers to make these things work, thinking they've advanced up to the level of, say, the United States or close to. She said she likens that to a rich person who loves art, who buys Picasso and thinks he's an artist. Picasso made the art. The technology, the engineering knowledge came from somewhere else, and it's imported in. You can't sustain it unless you keep importing it. And we can name some countries like that are at risk of not being very successful. Thank you very much.